Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to wait a few more seconds to allow everybody in the waiting room to filter on in. All right. Good afternoon again. My name is Andrea Sellers. I'm the Assistant Director for Regional Engagement with NC State's Alumni Association. I want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. A special thank you to our partners over with the College of Natural Resources. And there's Kayla and Dr. Stevenson, and also to our members at the Alumni Association. Your support goes to help us provide programming like this. This is a meeting that's being recorded, so this is a friendly reminder to remain on mute. If you have any questions, we encourage you to utilize the chat function below, and we will take time after Dr. Stevenson's program to take questions and answer, or do a Q&A session. And with that, I want to say welcome to our Get Outdoors series. This specific program is on environmental education, and I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Kathryn Stevenson, who's an assistant professor with the College of Natural Resources.
So we'll take the chance to click it up.
Is that it? Are we to me? Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to go ahead and start setting up my share screen. I was telling them, I don't know. Oh, the prep worked. But I'm going to spend probably about half an hour or so chatting with you all a little bit about our work and at least as it applies to the theme of getting outside. I'm in the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management Department, and my work focuses on youth and nature pretty broadly. I'll get into it a little bit more, but what I'm really going to focus on today is kind of the benefits, particularly to kids, of getting outside, but I think it applies to children of all ages. And for people who have kids or work with kids, I think it might be particularly interesting. And I'm going to try to keep it to around a half an hour or so, so that there's plenty of time for Q&A. If you have, I love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to chat more. So thanks for being here. And I guess with that, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Maybe. Here we go. Okay, so sometimes maybe it's a little helpful to sort of know a little bit about my background, where I'm from, and kind of what combination of experiences got me here, and it kind of certainly influences the perspective of the work that we do. I grew up in Hickory, North Carolina, so I'm a North Carolina native, and I went to undergrad at Davidson College, and that's probably where I first started to get interested in this line of work. I volunteered in the herpetology department, which at the time was like a pretty dynamic place for undergrad researchers. Our advisor had us just doing all kinds of stuff and publishing like crazy. We were out in the field. Most of my main jobs involved like trapping box turtles and doing some radiotelemetry with snakes in the field. And I liked that stuff a lot. And I thought I might go kind of into field biology. But then I started doing a lot more outreach, and I realized that was really kind of where my heart was. So we'd take our animals to classrooms, or I'd invite local school kids into the field with us to kind of show them how the lab worked. And I just really loved that. And so I got interested in outdoor and environmental education, sort of my latter part of Davidson. And then from there, I picked up and moved to California, sort of like 22 and wanted to go see the world. And I moved to Catalina Island. I worked in residential outdoor education there and taught kids how to snorkel and talk about the ocean. And that was about as magical as it sounds. It was really wonderful. And after working there, I transitioned to the classroom. I taught high school in San Francisco for 4 years. And then back to North Carolina, I came back to be kind of closer to my family. In Chapel Hill, I taught at Woods Charter School. And as I guess, at least as this picture illustrates, I was a high school science teacher mostly biology. And as much as possible, I was always getting my students outside, partly because I like to be outside, and partly because it seemed really like a natural fit to me. That we'd go outside and kind of talk about all the stuff we were learning about in the classroom. And I just sort of noticed more and more as we were out there, the kids just like really connected with the material better. They were excited about it. They were excited about class. And they were just sort of, like nicer to each other, right? Like everybody just seemed a lot happier. I mean, kids are excited, of course, everybody loves an outside day, but it just seemed like there was something going on there. And so when I decided to come back to grad school, I just sort of needed a little break from the classroom. I came to NC State. And I worked with Nils Peterson in Fisheries and Wildlife. And at that time, nobody was really doing a ton of environmental education. There were little pockets here and there, but I sort of made my own way there. And so I was interested in this kind of idea of this intersection of classroom education and outdoor education and sort of what's in the middle of there. And that's sort of where I started my research program. So I did my PhD here. I did a postdoc here, and then I got a job on faculty, I guess 5 years ago. I'm entering my 6th year. And so this is our crew, or at least part of them, at a conference when we were allowed to have in-person conferences the last time. But so I run a research program now around kids in the outdoors. So here's a screenshot of our website. We'll send you all the links if you want to dig around it. You're more than welcome to. But essentially, I think of what we do in sort of 2 major buckets. One is sort of children and nature research. So I don't know if you're on this talk, maybe you're familiar with things like the Children in Nature Network or Richard Lou's Last Child in the Woods, all of that good stuff. So I'm kind of interested in that line of work, sort of documenting the benefits that kids get from being outside and hopefully doing work that convinces people that it's a good idea. Because I really think it's a good idea, and I think everybody should have those opportunities, and not everybody does. And so trying to figure out how to kind of address that with research is a main core of that line of the house. And then the other side is we're interested in how kids can uniquely contribute to environmental challenges. And so we're interested in this idea of intergenerational learning, just like older generations and younger generations learning together, but we're potentially really interested in what kids have to teach adults. I think as an educator and certainly as a parent, I know that kids tell you a lot of really compelling things, right? Kids are just compelling to adults. And I'm sort of convinced that in an environmental context, when everything's so future oriented, kids are really great messengers for that. It's really hard to ignore kind of future impacts of things when you're looking at a child in the face. So we're sort of interested in that dynamic and how kids can participate in environmental solutions. And then also, I guess I'd be remiss if this is sort of an alumni call as far as what's going on at NC State with environmental ed. I teach the interp class, the interpretation course in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. So we're still that class has been going on for a long time. I certainly did not develop it, but we're marrying some interp and environmental ed stuff in that class. We also got off the ground an environmental education minor here. And so in addition to interpretation, we now teach environmental ed specific classes and work with the Office of Environmental Education with the Department of Environmental Quality to link that with the certification program. So that's been a lot of fun. That's, I guess we are officially about 2 years in, and it's been pretty popular so far. It's been fun to watch. And then I also teach a Children in Nature graduate course. So I'm mentoring graduate students in these issues. So it's a lot of fun. So I'm really excited to be here and couldn't be happier. So I think with the next few minutes, I'm just going to kind of give you a broad view of some of the stuff that we're into, and then end with some sort of ideas of how you could get outside this summer or how you might get involved at NC State or beyond. So a little bit about the base of where we're coming from and some of the research that we're drawing on. Children in Nature Network has done a really fantastic job of both pulling together all the research about the benefits of getting kids outside and also trying to organize it and hopefully spurring a little bit more. So when Richard Louv wrote his book, Last Child in the Woods, it came out in 2005. And at that point, this field was like pretty nascent. There was stuff going on, certainly, but it was very dispersed. And so after that book was published, the Children in Nature Network kind of grew out of that to sort of organize all the energy that was coming out behind him. And if you're not familiar with that book, I can also add that to the list of things to follow up. But anyway, they've done a really good job of kind of pulling together all this research. So this is just one screenshot of an infographic from their website. And essentially the point is that I don't want to suggest that getting kids outside is like a panacea for all individual or societal ills, but it does have a lot of really clear evidence-based benefits that are pretty broad. And it kind of reflects some of the stuff I was noticing with students, right? Like kids seem to be a little happier, like less stressed, better, like they can pay attention better. Sometimes they learn a little bit better. Sometimes they're given opportunities to like take risks in an area that's like pretty safe to their, physical self, but it allows them to grow and build self-confidence. And so there's a lot of really wonderful benefits for being outside. Along the bottom, there's this organization called the Blue Sky Funders Forum, and they're trying to bring together a bunch of philanthropists that are interested in environmental education. And they think of these outcomes sort of based on these 5 buckets. So they kind of identify when you're thinking about getting kids outside, you can think about benefits to education, so some sort of like schools and outdoor stuff, youth development, things like confidence and team building, like basic summer camp stuff. That's really aligned with this work. Conservation benefits. Obviously, in the College of Natural Resources, we are interested in kind of creating environmental stewards. Kind of what better way than to get them outside and developing sort of connection to nature and kind of an ethos of care for the environment. Health and well-being, certainly, there's a lot of research coming out, some of which we contributed to, and I'll hit on about how, especially in the times of COVID, being outside has been a real salve for a lot of people and help support mental health. And then social justice issues, as I was mentioning before, I think access to nature is certainly not equitable. Access to green spaces is not equitable. So a lot of work being done to sort of point that out, first step, and then figure out how we can create policies and dismantle others that make access to nature and its benefits a lot more equitable. So that's sort of our starting point. And I'm gonna just run through a couple of different ways that we try to contribute to all of this stuff. And so one of the things that we look at is I spend a lot of time doing research in schools. Part of that is because it's just kind of my background, right? So I was a classroom teacher, so I sort of know the system. And so that's one of the pragmatic reasons we might do research in schools. Another reason is that when we are thinking about issues of access and equity, public schools especially are kind of one of the only truly public institutions we have left. Not to say that there aren't problems or that they're all equitable, but if you want to reach all kids, schools is a really good place to start. And so the hope is that by doing research in kids and trying to bring more nature into schools or bring schools more outside, more often we're providing more opportunities for kids to interact with nature and garner all these like really wonderful benefits. So a lot of the pictures you see here are from Lincoln Heights Elementary. So in Wake County, we have a couple of environmental connections magnets. So they're magnet schools that are focused on getting kids connected with the environment. So that's one of them. And we try to work with those people in both a research and a service learning context within our teaching. So I guess just one little piece of information. This is from, this study is one that was part of my dissertation. So this wasn't that long ago, but it feels like a really long time ago. So this was in 2013. We looked at different predictors of environmental literacy. So meaning like, what do kids know about the environment? How do they feel about it? How do they think about it? And what do they do about it? Or sort of the 4 pillars of environmental literacy. And here the affect and behavior would be like, well, how do they feel and what do they think? And so what you're looking at is that these are essentially the difference between kids who go outside and don't. So that like in a school setting, whose teachers take them outside and whose don't, right? And so 0 is the don't, and the bars are compared to the ones that do compared to the ones that don't. So all students on average, you can see, like if you take kids outside, they're going to care about the environment more and they're going to be more engaged in environmental behaviors. But something kind of interesting we saw here was that it seemed to be, that dynamic seemed to be even more pronounced among students that identified as Black or African American and students who were Hispanic or Latinx. So that we thought that finding was kind of cool and sort of pointed us toward a line of research interested in not only how outdoor education and time outside can benefit everybody, but how it might have differential impacts on students who can struggle in classrooms, or students who like deficit models would say these kids are less likely to perform well in schools. But as it turns out, environmental education can sometimes sort of flip that script. And there's different reasons we might think so, and I can talk about that more if you'd like. Another setting that which we've done a lot of research is in what we'll call school park partnerships. And most specifically, we've worked with other organizations, but we've worked a ton with a nonprofit out of Brevard called Muddy Sneakers. Now they're sort of slowly expanding across, well, not slowly, they've been expanding across the state. And their model is that they partner with public schools with 5th grade classrooms, and they take 5th graders outside into local natural areas, many times parks, but essentially they have to be some sort of protected area. They do some work with land trusts. And so the instructors will meet the kids on site and they spend the whole day outside teaching science, and it's aligned with state standards. So they might do, so in 5th grade, you learn about like forces in motion or energy or heat. So it's not always kind of what you think of as traditional EE, which is a lot of times like macroinvertebrate stream studies, which are wonderful, but it's like this goes a little bit, it covers all of the 5th grade standards. So anyway, we've been working with Muddy Sneakers for a while, doing some evaluation, but also done a fair amount of research. And sort of like the study I was talking about before, what we're most excited about are sort of lines that sort of support this idea that outdoor education can kind of help kids in ways that traditional education doesn't always. And so some examples of what we're talking about. We recently had a paper published out about how outdoor science education is what we were talking about. I'm seeing some chats. I'm gonna come back to that. We're seeing some. Sorry, I lost my train. Oh, so outdoor science education. So we're talking about Muddy Sneakers, how it might particularly benefit girls in learning science. So there's been, like well-documented STEM gaps, gender gaps for a long time. They're certainly getting better. I think girls in general at this point are performing about the same level as, if not more than, boys in school. But there's still sort of this pervasive leaky pipeline in which we see it's much less common to see, say, like a woman physicist than a man physicist. And so there's something going on there still, right? And so one idea is that environmental education is a pretty good example of how we might employ the types of teaching practices that are inclusive to girls, meaning it kind of allows them to sort of see themselves in science. So typically, like when kids write or asked to draw pictures of a scientist, they're still going to come up with like a man in white hair with a lab coat on with beakers, right? And science is a lot broader than that. And so by doing sort of like outside the box things, like taking kids into the woods all day, the hypothesis anyway is that maybe it's a little bit easier to see more types of kids, more groups of kids to see themselves as scientists. And so here we're focusing on girls. And so what we found in this, if you maybe you've been digesting these graphs, that the treatment was kids who went on Muddy Sneakers, and the control was just kids that are not enrolled in Muddy Sneakers. And so one of the things that I want to point out is here we're looking at girls. So what we can see, first of all, girls tend to get better grades than boys in science in general, and that's sort of what we'd expect. But in the control group, we can see girls start to kind of fall off in their grades in science, like about to where boys are. And that's kind of typical for science engagement. Girls kind of start to pull back from science at about 5th grade. But we can see they kind of maintained their engagement with Muddy Sneakers. And similar science knowledge, that was sort of a measure of if kids kind of know what science is about. like that it's, there's experiments and that, you don't always get the right answer and you try again and all of those things. Girls, the Muddy Sneakers experience seemed to support girls' learning of science knowledge a lot better than the control. So, that was one bright spot from the Muddy Sneakers work. Another one that we were excited about was we looked at specifically at kids with IEPs, which stands for an individualized education plan. So sometimes that could be kids with cognitive disorders, behavioral or affective, just like there's something about their learning style that needs some extra attention, enough that they have like a formalized accommodation plan. And so we looked just at those kids and we asked teachers, how do you think they're going to do outside versus in the classroom? And invariably teachers thought, oh, they're not going to be able to pay attention, their behavior is going to be horrible. Teachers get pretty nervous about taking kids outside in general, some do, and particularly kind of their kids that they struggle with to kind of fall in line, for that lack of a better word. But what we saw was that the kids, this is the teachers' reports of them, is they expected these kids to do not so great outside, but they did just as well, if not better, outside than they did inside. And that really squares with a lot of, at least my personal experience and many of my friends working in this work, is that kids like with ADD or just any kind of thing that makes them quite like spaz out a little bit in the classroom and really have a hard time focusing, outside they just like come alive and they're good at it and it builds their confidence. So this is something we were pretty excited to see. Another perspective I wanted to hit on beyond the kind of the school setting is that we do just look at kind of like general outdoor recreation too, right? And so this is a little bit more inclusive adults, because we aren't in school, most of us anymore, especially except for those of us who decide to make a career of it. We're always in school. But we've done some work around just like general activity patterns. And so one of actually this study did come out of the Muddy Sneakers data set too. So when we were talking to kids about their experience with Muddy Sneakers, we also asked them just sort of like, how do you play outside? Do you play outside? Do you play with friends? Do you play with adults? Do you play by yourself? What do? Do you play sports? Do you go camping? All of those things. And apologies if this is difficult to see. I'm hoping on Zoom it'll be big enough for you to see. And but if you can think of this sort of like a decision tree, or like, those quizzes you might take on BuzzFeed or like in magazines, like, should you wear yoga pants? And then it's kind of branches off from there. But really what I'd like for you to kind of understand from this is that these dark green boxes at the end are kids who have very high connection to nature, and the paths are sort of the combinations of activities. And I think the take home from this, there's a couple take homes, is the most important thing, like the biggest splitter of whether kids are connected to nature or not, was whether they get to have time outside by themselves, which is increasingly rare, right? Or at least some sort of perception of being by themselves. I'm not trying to advocate for just turning your children loose in the woods, never to be seen again, but the opportunities for contemplative kind of quiet time in nature seems really important. But on top of that, beyond that initial time outside, time in groups is also really important. So it helps kids kind of be socialized into being outdoors and seeing that as part of sort of like their daily, or their, just kind of who they are and what they do. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that there are lots of different pathways essentially to doing this. So if you'll notice here, so like to get to this green box, these kids were spending time outside by themselves almost weekly. They're fishing 3 to 4 times a year, and they're camping 1 to 2 times a year. So this you might see like the traditional like kind of nature kid path. Those kids are connected to nature. But then this person, they're spending time outside by themselves, but they're also going on hikes and they're playing sports outside. So that's sort of like a different set of recreation patterns. And then here, these kids are not spending very much time outside by themselves, but they're hunting, which is maybe a similar kind of contemplative, sort of like you're sitting in the woods being quiet kind of activity. They also spend time with their families, and they spend out time with their groups, maybe in like a scouting troop or something. So I guess the point of this is that time outdoors, like repeated experiences and varied experiences, can kind of all get you to this sort of connection to nature, or kind of building this to be part of your life. So that's something kind of we're interested in, as people who are interested in getting people to care about nature, is getting them outside a lot. Another reason we might be excited about getting people outside in nature is because it's good for your health. And so this was really highlighted in a study we've done during COVID. So I had the student who was all set up to do a survey on kids and their recreation patterns through schools, and then the pandemic hit, and we're like, uh-oh, we can't do that. We couldn't do any research in schools for months and months. And so we pivoted and instead worked with like a survey company and surveyed kids all across the country on their recreation patterns, both kind of before COVID and during COVID, to see how that was happening, and also kind of what impact that might be having on their mental well-being. And I mean, I don't think that I have to remind you, during the pandemic, people, like, it was hard, especially in the early days of the pandemic. We didn't really know what was safe, and just people were not getting outside a ton, and parks were closing. Beaches were closed. And then there were a lot of guidelines coming out about what you could and couldn't do. Sometimes they're confusing. There was a lot of fear. But then kind of as it all settled down, we kind of realized being outside is probably about one of the safest places to be in terms of COVID. And it actually probably had a lot of mental health benefits. So as I mentioned, this was kind of a national survey we ran. I'll kind of get through that. But essentially we were interested in, so again, how are kids' recreation patterns changing? How is their health and well-being changing? And all are those things related? And essentially what we found was that, not surprisingly, they were not getting outside quite as much as they had been before the pandemic. So we asked, like, how often are you doing this kind of stuff this time last year? And how much are you doing things now? And you can see, like, outdoor play, that was just things like going for runs, walks, bike rides, nature-based things like hiking and camping. And then just spending time outside with their families. And so their recreation patterns were taking a hit. Also, everyone's well-being was taking a hit. And that was true across demographics, right? And we see some slight differences, but basically it's pretty stable. Kind of everybody was not feeling as good as they were last year, which, I don't know, that squares with my experience. I bet it does with many of yours. But for the kids that were able to keep getting outside, that hit in mental health seemed to be a lot less. So what we can see here is that some kids, not very many, I'm talking like 10% of the kids, were getting outside more during the pandemic than they were before the pandemic. And those kids seem to have as well, like, their well-being levels were just as high as they were before COVID. And similar with same activities, staying pretty darn close. But when they had a decrease in activity, their mental health was also really taking a hit. And the same was true for just strictly nature-based activities. And then pretty much the same for just sort of family-based activities too. So I guess what we're taking from this is that getting kids outside, at least from the perspective of people in college and natural resources, we often get excited about that because we want to build connections to nature, because that's linked to sort of an ethos of care. We want people connected to place so that they take care of those places, right? But then we're also interested in sort of the restorative benefits and the health benefits of getting outside. And sort of what we're learning from this is that getting kids outside is a relatively easy way, but also pretty powerful way to make them a bit more resilient to stress. So we are hopeful that this pandemic is coming to a close, but kind of unfortunately, but in reality, kids are going to face all kinds of stressors, right? Just high school is stressful, much less a global pandemic. But getting kids outside and kind of building those patterns seems to be a way to build some resiliency. Then also, before I kind of leave the research portion, I just wanted to take a little nod to kind of the other side of the house of the research that we're doing, which I'm not going to get into it right now, but I'm happy to chat more about it if you'd like. Is, again, we're really interested in this idea of how kind of changes in students can lead to changes in families, which also might lead to changes in communities. So we did a study that got a fair amount of press a few years ago, looking at climate change education. So talking to kids about climate change in schools. And then inviting families just to enter in a conversation about what kids were learning in schools really seemed to increase climate change concern among parents, which was a pretty big deal because historically it's been really hard to change people's minds about climate change. Either you're concerned about it or you're not, and that's pretty static. But it seemed to be that kids were able to sort of move the needle regardless of political affiliation, and particularly among audiences that are typically the most skeptical of climate change. So that we were pretty excited about that, and kind of thinking about how kids might be a way to activate some universal values around particularly the environment. So everybody has their own value sets, which they interpret the world and make decisions, and that's just kind of what it means to be human. That is okay. But sometimes when we can find common values, that makes common ground a lot more possible. And so in an era of intense polarization, we're hopeful that some kid-led conversations might help people kind of remember, like, well, it doesn't matter kind of where you come from. We all want something good for our kids. And so it maybe helps people enter those conversations in a little bit different posture. So we've been doing this. We're on climate change. We've got a project with marine debris. That's a girl putting on a trash fashion show. It was part of their community engagement event. And we're also looking at how kids like agriculture education can kind of engage families in talking about local food systems and sustainable agriculture. So I think I'm probably hitting my 30-minute mark, but I just want to close with a couple of things that maybe you can consider doing in your own communities or connected with NC State about just promote it, like getting yourself outside and getting potentially your families or children in your lives outside. One is just finding your park. So I'd be remiss if I were in the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Department not talking about finding your parks. We are super, super lucky in this state, a really wide network of both local and state parks. And so just a reminder, if you haven't been in your parks like our family has during the pandemic, they are there and they are awesome. So one thing is just getting outside. So and I guess I also want to stress to get these benefits of nature that we've been talking about a lot, it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to go to Yellowstone. You don't even have to go to Mount Mitchell if you're in Raleigh. Just getting to your local parks seems to make a big difference. This sort of day-to-day nature dose. Those parks are wonderful. Certainly visit them. They're great. But even just getting in your backyard and taking a moment can really help, and help your kids too. If more of the training and professional development, like if you're interested in being an environmental educator, I just wanted to, or just taking more professional development just to learn more about natural history in your area. One thing I wanted to make a plug for, if you aren't aware already, the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education and Public Affairs is just like a treasure trove of information. So this is just a screenshot of their website, and their website's just EE North Carolina. And if you click on events, there are like tons of professional development opportunities, some of which will lead to a certification in environmental education. So I was mentioning the minor at NC State is correlated with that certification. So we're trying to get students certified, but anyone can do it. And they're, even if you don't complete your certification, they're really a great way just to sort of network with other people who are interested in connecting people to nature. And they're just a good group of folks. Or they have workshops on kind of how to teach other people about nature, but then they also sometimes have workshops on just like, if you want to learn about bats or if you want to learn about frogs, they have great workshops, just like hour-long or 2-hour webinars or short hikes in areas kind of all over the state. You can find kind of like naturalist-led hikes to go on. So they really are. I cannot say enough about these guys. They're wonderful. And if you're interested in jobs and internships too, this is like the one-stop shop for things related to environmental education and probably interpretation too in the state. A little plug for a book. If you do have children in your lives or are just interested or kind of childlike yourself, this is a great book. I mean, I will disclose I have a chapter in it, but I will also offer that there are way more talented naturalists than I am. I was mostly excited to read the book because of people like Jesse Pope that are in there telling me all about Grandfather Mountain, where he's worked for years. But it's the way I'd kind of describe it is like field guide meets like kind of Lonely Planet for kids. So the chapters are all set up to sort of plan out a trip, particularly with children, at these 30 places across North Carolina. Some are municipal parks, some are state parks, some and kind of everywhere in between. So especially if you're new to the state, but even if you've lived here for years, like I have, it's a really great resource. And then I'd also just nod to the Children in Nature Network. If you just are kind of into this stuff, they have all kinds of just cool blog posts like by Richard Louvre, like 10 things you can do with your kids this summer, or just if you have ideas, if you're pandemicking at home with your children still, ideas to get them outside, or if you're, they have tons of resources. They also have a research library through their website. So if you're working in this field and looking for evidence to support things, they have a really great searchable tool. So you can say, you know, can you give me some papers that support X? You can probably find it through them. So they're really wonderful. And then stuff going on in NC State. So I mentioned this minor. If you know people who are enrolled at NC State and you want to send them to it, this is a new system to sign up for any of the minors, but that's also where you find all the information. The Natural Learning Initiative, if you aren't familiar with them, they are just like wonderful. Robin Moore is retiring soon, but they just hired a new director who I'm so excited to get to know and work with. She seems really wonderful. So that place is going to remain strong and do really cool things. So they're with the School of Design and focus on designing nature play spaces for children at parks or schools, or kind of anywhere that people want to put them. And so they have a kind of a research arm that researches the impacts of that stuff, and then they have a design arm where they go into the community and help communities design these spaces. And then outdoor adventures, just getting it doesn't have to be academic. You can just get outside and go for a paddle. There's just tons of stuff that they've got going on, both instructor-led or also just like renting a canoe. My family did that last week for $30. You can rent the canoe for the whole weekend. So I don't know, there's really wonderful things going on at state as far as getting people outside. If you want to learn more, they will send you the email, but I'll just put this up on there. As far as my contact information, you're welcome to reach out. These handles are Twitter handles if you'd like to follow along. I don't tweet a ton, but this is our lab's Twitter account, and my students also have access, and they're much better than I am at putting stuff up, so you can kind of follow along as to what we're up to. And I think that's about it. And I haven't really been paying attention to the questions, but I look forward to looking through them and chatting more. So I'll stop sharing and see what questions we have.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to use the chat function, or if you feel comfortable coming off of mute and asking them for Dr. Stevenson.
I think okay, let's see. A copy of the presentation. I think it's being recorded. I think
Yep, we'll be sending that out in the coming week. How can we encourage more outdoor classroom
instruction in schools? Excellent question. Where is that, Beverly? Thanks for that, Beverly. There's a lot of ways, right? The way that we're trying to do it is providing evidence that we're hoping schools especially find compelling. That's a lot of the reason we do a lot of work with science learning, to be transparent. I mean, I care if kids are learning science. I think that's a good thing. But it's often not like the outcome of my heart. It's not what I care about the most. I'm more interested in getting kids connected to nature. But I do a lot of that research because I think it's one of the things that schools really care about is test scores. And so we are interested in producing that evidence. But I think as far as it depends, I guess, on your what your connection is to schools. I think that as I'm learning, I have a kindergartner. As I'm learning, PTAs can be really powerful. It depends on the school, but I think that's one way to make a difference at least your local schools, is just to engage the PTA. If you're a parent, that's like there's an obvious pathway there. But even if you're not a parent, engaging with them and kind of reaching out and kind of offering to get involved, that might be a fruitful way. And And as far as like a more of a policy level, at least in North Carolina, there are some really sympathetic DPI people. I think anytime you get into government, it's difficult because things, especially in our state, seem to kind of can change really drastically depending on the election cycle. And so sometimes it can make people reticent to do things that are long-term. But the Department of Public Instruction has some people that are really excited about getting kids outside. So I think looking for even like recently, there's been public comment periods open for different standard revisions. You just like staying engaged in those, staying engaged in local government, just to sort of look for opportunities where policy might intersect kids. I think that is something I personally am challenged to do more, because I think it really does make an impact the more I get into it, realizing that those policy decisions sometimes are just like squeaky citizens demanding it, right? Whether that's at a school level or more like a district or even state level. So I guess I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I guess there are a lot of ways, and it just sort of, I think it maybe is a match between your comfort level and your talents and kind of your sphere of influence. But I think I think if you need help with getting evidence together to make a case, I think that's sort of our bread and butter. So I think we help with that too. Let's see. Natural resources beat out the engineering school to claim EE acronym. Maybe, I don't know. I use it. I don't know if I beat them out, but I just use it. That's how the environmental education community always says EE. That it's quite possible the electrical engineering community uses it as well. And oh, Arlene, thank you for reposting that. I saw that as a private message. I was trying to get back around to that. The effects of nature-based outdoor learning at different ages and grade levels. That's a good question. I'm not sure if I have a tidy answer for you, but there's some research and kind of guidelines out there as far as like kind of developmental appropriateness of nature engagement across the lifespan. And everything that I've read is saying like it's certainly never too early to get your kids outside, right? There's some research on just like benefits of getting even infants outside, right? And when they're young, really it's just about like getting them exposed, right? And then as kids grow up, I think layering on things like just tapping into their natural curiosity and observation skills. I think it's just good education in general to sort of let kids tell you what they're interested in, and then they can kind of lead you through what they want to do. But there is a fair amount of research that I'm trying to remember what the cutoff age is, but like before age, I want to say 7, 8 or something, we really start to imprint sort of our go-to patterns. I mean, sort of in life, but certainly in the recreation field, right? So if you kind of grow up, it doesn't have to be that intense, but if you're kind of like normalized into like, we go outside as a family, or like I'm a kid that goes outside, or I'm a kid that plays sports, or I'm a kid that does X, Y, and Z, we start to really kind of lay the foundation for those patterns as a young kid. And then I'd say through kind of later childhood, 7 to 12 or so, they start to solidify a little bit more. And then and I think families have a lot more to play with that in the beginning, or potentially schools, or things that are, because kids in childhood, you're a lot more mediated, right? Like you only have the opportunities that basically adults allow you to have, right? And then as kids age, it becomes a lot more important to embed a lot more socialization into that, right? So as kids are starting to form their identities, they want to start hanging out with friends a lot more than family. So trying to figure out ways to get kids outside that also involve other people, right? Whether that might be scouts or, clubs. And as we saw on that one slide, the kind of crazy decision tree thing, even playing sports outside, right? Like creating kind of recreation patterns that sort of start to build their lifelong toolbox of things that they enjoy doing and they can kind of keep coming back to. I'm hoping that sort of answers your question, Arlene. I'm not sure. Feel free to clarify if it does not. Okay, cool. Oh, scouting, yeah, BSA. Sorry, I'm just reading out loud your comments. Yeah, and Children in Nature does have a lot of great infographics that are really great for storytelling, right? Both for you to learn easily, but also to show other people, like, no, I'm serious about this. There's really good research that shows it's not just like playtime, that people are getting a lot of benefits from being outside. Not to knock playtime. There's a lot of benefit of just play.
All right, well, unless there are any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and let everybody have a nice rest of their lunch break. I want to say big thank you again to Dr. Stevenson and to our partners at the College of Natural Resources. We're so grateful to be able to provide such excellent and engaging programming on a wide variety of topics. And like Kayla messaged in the group, 2 lucky attendees of today's session will be receiving a signed copy of the book that Dr. Stevenson referenced earlier. We will be sending out a recording of this, so keep an eye out for that in your email inbox. Thank you all for joining us today, and as always, go Pack.
All right, thanks guys. Have a great day.